Vijay Amritraj, tennis legend and someone who's called multiple Federer matches over the last 2 decades, joins me now from Chennai. Vijay is busy running the WTA Chennai Open tournament, and I really do appreciate you finding time, Vijay. You know, I distinctively remember your commentary each time Roger Federer would win Wimbledon. Those distinct three words, he's got it. But at 41, Vijay,
Yeah.
he has decided he hasn't got it. And as Rafael Nadal said, a sad day for the sport.
Well, it was certainly coming. He's 41 years of age. He's won everything there is to have won. But, we can talk numbers all day long because he's really got all the numbers that you could possibly want. So let's leave the numbers aside for a moment and discuss tennis the way it was played by Roger Federer. And I think you could use a lot of superlative words to describe the way Federer played. Things like grace and elegance and beauty and ballet.
Perfection, Vijay? Perfection? I think that one word which sort of everyone is sort of has agreed upon is perfection.
Yes, I think perfection, certainly guys who have become number one in the world have been striving for perfection. And McEnroe found it hard on himself. He really got hard on himself for the simple reason he was looking for the perfect match. He was looking for the perfect shot every time he played in. But Federer did it with such grace and elegance. And, we always loved watching Federer play. As I always said, he played a modern version of yesterday's tennis.
Yes, and just trying to think back on what you were saying and just the Federer memories that sort of stir inside you. Rafa Nadal was always about that power game. Djokovic was always that gritty counter puncher. But Federer sort of was effortless. And perhaps that, Vijay, also explains why this young kid from Switzerland, who at one point of time used to smash his rackets, he evolved into perhaps one of the most recognized faces on the planet.
Oh, no question about it. And similar issue with WION. Borg, when he started playing tennis, was also used to get very upset. He smashed his racket and they took away his racket for 6 months. And that's what set him straight. So I think a lot of it is said in a similar fashion about Federer. But the interesting thing about Roger is he got started in a style of play that was so fluent and so easy that he always looked like he was putting out 50% effort for 110% return. Whereas Rafa, getting the 110% return, putting out 150% effort. And so I think that was the big difference. And the rivalry between two of them became so much of an interest to the world to watch because of the way both of them played a different format, but bringing their best tennis in the forefront against each other. Those matches at Wimbledon in the finals that they both played were not just, they stand out in memory, obviously, like we look back at the Borg-McEnroe match of '80 and so on and so forth, that there are these rivalries that make it so special, make our game so special. And Federer, Nadal, and then, of course, Djokovic coming on later, and then Murray perhaps coming on a bit later. All of these things made our sport so incredibly special and so global at the same time.
Yes, Vijay, I'll get in on that rivalry in just a bit because you mentioned Djokovic, you mentioned Rafael Nadal. And so I'm going to attempt to go straight to the GOAT debate. The numbers say Nadal's got 22, Djokovic has got 21, Federer has got 20. But we also need to perhaps look at this entire rivalry in hindsight and give some perspective to it. Because when Federer started out, the benchmark was 14. It was Pete Sampras's 14. Federer pushed it to 17, then went and extended it to 20. Perhaps when we judge everything today, so many years down the line, we're forgetting that this was a man who made his debut in 1998. And for the last part, perhaps the last 6 or 7 years, it's been a phase where other players would have already retired.
We can talk about this all day long, but at the end of the day, we're just fortunate to have seen three of the greatest players of all time play in the same era. That is incredibly unusual to see all these guys at 20, 21, and 22. And we're talking about majors here. We're not talking about just tour titles. We're talking about majors. And so obviously Federer got there first. Nadal came along and caught him, then went ahead a little bit, and then Djokovic came ahead and caught them both, and then so on and so forth. But let's not forget that all three of them are pretty much in the same category as far as GOATs are concerned. And the strange thing is that they're playing in the same era. That is the thing that is quite spectacular. You know, when Pete got to 14, he got to 14. And when Emerson got to 12, he got to 12. Uh, you know, so you can't start comparing. We never compare different eras. But at the end of the day, the thing that kind of draws us to Federer constantly is not just winning those 20, but the way he won them and the way he won it with that kind of method of playing that made us all feel that we should kind of go out and play tennis. You know, and the good thing is he did win that French Championships. Let's put an asterisk there for a moment, because the reason he managed to win that French Championships because Soderling took out Nadal that year, and that made a huge difference. And the interesting thing, of course, is the fact that clay and grass got to be fairly close to one another in speeds and surfaces and so on after perhaps the early 2000s. All these things made a huge, big difference to Rafa also winning Wimbledon first before Federer won the French.
Yes, and also when you look back on the Federer journey, we have to take into account that this was a man who made his debut in 1998. It's the longevity also. How many players have sort of been that active? The only other player who comes to mind is perhaps the great Martina Navratilova in women's tennis. And we've seen Serena Williams just retire as well. So Serena and Roger Federer sort of stretching the boundaries of what the modern sports person can achieve.
Well, you're talking certainly about the modern era, an open era. And if we go back and look in time, needless to say, Rosewall, for example, won the French Championships at 17, and then he won it again at 34, the same tournament. I mean, that's remarkable. And obviously, for about 8-9 years in between, he couldn't play because tennis wasn't open at the time. So there are lots of examples we can draw. But at the end of the day, to play under today's circumstances and with today's competition and the athletic ability and prowess that you need to be able to play this kind of tennis for long durations of time is not easy. The good news is that he has managed his career beautifully. He has played less tournaments. He has prepared himself perfectly. His body takes what it can take that Federer has thrown at it. And of course, let's get back to the way he played. And the way he played allowed him to play longer.
Yes, I was reading somewhere this morning that one of the things that defined Roger Federer, that even in defeat, there was always a Federer masterclass, and that perhaps just wasn't enough that day to take him over the line. Just you mentioned the Rafa Nadal final of 2008. Let's go back to 2018, the greatest Wimbledon final, which they say of all time. That was sort of Federer, you know, Djokovic at the other end, just pumped up, trying to give it his all. But here was Federer sort of you could barely look at him and imagine that this was a man who was, what, 37, 38, and he was still going to toe-to-toe with the most dominant player at that time.
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. And the fact that he was able to keep that level of performance, excuse me, for so long at such a high level is one thing, to have the physical fitness to be able to do it. The second thing, which is even tougher perhaps, is the desire to work to get there. And the third thing is to have that mental focus for that duration of time for each of these matches. To get to the final, you have to win 6 matches at these Grand Slams. And, you know, to keep that mental focus for so long and with such great desire to work so that you can stay ahead of the next youngster coming along is unimaginable. And frankly, that is his greatest strength, the fact that he could focus and work and realize that all these young guys are coming along at the time, Tsitsipas's and the Zverevs and the Medvedevs and all of them coming along. But at the same time, not just getting past them, but stay focused to also make sure that you're able to get past the Djokovic's and the Nadals at the same time. A near impossibility.
Yes, and just talking about Nadal, because let's go back to when Federer started. Sort of his first great rival was Andy Roddick, and then came along this Spanish teenager called Rafael Nadal. The head-to-head record very skewed towards Rafael Nadal, but I just sort of dug into that 40-match head-to-head between both of them. Federer won 16 of them, but let's not forget that Nadal is the greatest clay court player of all time, and 14 of his wins have come against Federer on clay. You sort of take that out, and that's 16-10.
Yeah, of course. Of course, we can analyze and chip and cut and all of that with all these head-to-heads and matches and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if we look at numbers, it is 2021 and 22 as we stand today. And I would have never imagined that someone was going to get past Federer's 20, to be honest. For that matter, we didn't think anyone was going to get past Borg's 5 Wimbledons or 6 Frenches. And amazingly, it has happened. I certainly don't think that any of these 3 guys are going to be, beaten by anyone else certainly during my lifetime. But again, these things do happen. And when we start looking at numbers, there are 2 guys ahead of him at this point in time. None of the 3 of them have won a calendar Grand Slam, which is the true Grand Slam, as we all know it. We're talking about majors at this point, 2021 and 22. We got to be quite specific about that. We use the word Grand Slam rather loosely. But at the end of the day, all of these 3 guys have created an environment at the very top that is literally the Everest of tennis. And all of them to have gotten and played at the same time is what makes this era so fascinating. Are we going to get another era of this nature between the next set of youngsters coming along, the next Gen 2? I don't know. It's easy to say no because of what these guys have achieved. But frankly speaking, these guys have taken tennis to a new dimension.
Yes, they have done that. Just touching on the Federer-Nadal rivalry, because I was just remembering, because when Nadal came along, initially there was a bit of tension. Nadal started beating Roger Federer. That was a point where Federer had this unparalleled reign across men's tennis. But over the years, Vijay, that rivalry blossomed into healthy respect, and they now call each other friends. I'm not sure both of them call Novak Djokovic a friend, but that just shows how sort of both of them have embraced what both of them have got into tennis, and how each one of them has pushed the other on to greater heights. And that's sort of the defining rivalry of this generation. We never say Federer, Djokovic, or we say Nadal, Djokovic. The first thing that comes to mind is always Federer, Nadal.
Well, I guess Nadal came along first to challenge Federer and started beating him. And then, of course, once you beat someone, you think the guy's not good enough till he beats you again, which is what McEnroe felt to me many years ago. But I think when you look at that rivalry that got started, and then Federer realized this guy is someone who's going to challenge me all the way through my career. Needless to say, Djokovic came right behind him. Djokovic and Murray are pretty much the same age group, I think. So when you look at the challengers that came along, and then the challengers got good enough to start to push Federer and Nadal, and then Djokovic started to climb up there into that same stratosphere of these 2 guys. And then they found another guy knocking at the door on a regular basis. They all had to raise the level of the game. Needless to say, Federer and Nadal. Nadal kept getting better on clay as he won every French championships. And Federer started to realize that with the courts being fairly slow at Wimbledon, that he was going to start to be pressed at Wimbledon as well. So everyone started to get a bit better. The quality of tennis started to get a bit better. The youngsters coming along fell back a little bit more to catch up with these 3 guys. Needless to say, Andy Murray joined the mix in there as well. So all of a sudden, the quality of tennis by these 3 or 4 guys got to such a height that it was tougher and tougher for the next gen to be able to catch them. And that's what makes these guys so great, because they was able to stay ahead of the pack for such a long duration of time. Needless to say, they were playing only singles, 7 matches over 14 days at the Grand Slams. And unless they played great 5-set matches, recovery was a lot sooner. All of these things that came into play, they were traveling with teams of people to look after their bodies, make sure that they could play these 5 sets over 7 matches in 14 days. All these things came into play as they went along. And we heard about Djokovic, sleeping in ice tents and so on and so forth to be able to put his body into quick recovery. All these things came into play over the last decade and a half. And that's what made all these rivalries so very tight. But when we talk about Federer, we always talk about Nadal to go with it.
Yes. Also, you mentioned the fact that, ultimately cold logic will say 22, 21, 20. But there are also some other numbers, Vijay, which I found very fascinating. And perhaps we need to look at all of them sort of with some blinkers on. And they're interesting because Federer reached 23 consecutive Grand Slam semi-finals. Federer reached 36 consecutive Grand Slam quarterfinals. 10 Grand Slams finals he reached between 2005 2007. He also reached the finals of all 4 Grand Slams in a calendar year thrice. Djokovic has done it twice, Nadal never. So perhaps that also explains why there's sort of been this tilt towards Roger Federer, emotionally perhaps, than from the statistical perspective.
Yes, I think the reason we tilt towards Roger Federer globally is really because of the way he played, the way he conducted himself, the way he played. He looks graceful when he played the game. Even when he missed, he looked like a ballet dancer. So you kind of tended to favor that portion of it in the subconscious on a regular basis. And I can understand that completely because he's so beautiful to watch. Even in a first round match, if he was winning comfortably, it was very hard to root for the underdog. He ended up rooting for the favorite. So it made that. Certainly Nadal had an incredible share of fans, as did Djokovic. But at the end of the day, when you talk about 2021 and 22, that doesn't come into play when you have a strong emotional connect with someone like a Federer. And I think when you watch him play, that comes out in you. You forget about the numbers.
Yes, I don't know. I'm not too much into cars, but I would say that perhaps Federer's the Rolls Royce, Djokovic and Nadal would be the Ferraris, if I could go down there. But Vijay, it's you mentioned the emotional connect. Perhaps the true sort of your legacy is how people react when you leave the sport, and just seeing the reactions to Roger Federer's announcement that he's going to call time on his career. It's coming from the greatest sports persons of different sports. It's not just the voices in tennis. And perhaps for the last 20 years, Roger Federer has not just been tennis's most saleable face, he's been its greatest ambassador.
Yes, and let's not forget, tennis is a global sport, like football is. And I really draw a comparison to the two of them. Most of our sports worldwide are very nation-centric. And when you look at tennis as the second most global sport in the world, and an individual sport at that, and in that sport, you have reached the pinnacle and then some. You played globally, you're known globally, you're followed globally, and you're watched globally because the sport is in every corner of the earth. Every country in the world plays in the Davis Cup. So you're talking about something that makes you a global icon and a global superstar. And people have seen you on television, and people have watched you in these particular countries that you've actually played in. All these things resonate with people for a long duration of time. Someone asked me in the US, a journalist asked me in the US after the New England Patriots won the Super Bowl, who would be more famous globally? Would it be Tom Brady or Virat Kohli? And I said Roger Federer. Because of the sport that he played and the height at which he played it. And he became the most recognizable face in sport. Perhaps the closest comparison I would perhaps draw is Tiger Woods, and who had transformed golf. And then you look at the Usain Bolt, who transformed the running bit of it. And, and then you go back way in time and you look at Muhammad Ali, but Muhammad Ali was more than a boxer. Boxing was just an avenue for him to do what he ended up doing. So I think when you look at Roger, I think the fact remains that he played the game at such a high level, became the first to reach that mark of 20 from a numbers perspective. But more than anything else, the way he carried himself and the way he played, all of those things will resonate with people for longer periods of time.
Okay, just winding this down, Vijay. He wanted one final shot at Wimbledon. Sadly, that won't happen. But it's perhaps fitting that he's going to be flanked when he sort of leaves the game. He's going to be flanked by Nadal, Djokovic, and Andy Murray, the three men who sort of pushed him to greater heights, and that's perhaps the greatest send-off he could hope for.
Well, yes, and I think all the three of them also agreed to play Laver Cup, in my humble opinion, because they probably felt that this was coming from Federer, and this was a good way to do this. And to see all four of them together at Laver Cup in London would be a very special moment, no question about it. And the respect they have for each other is overwhelming. The respect that all of us as tennis players have had a chance to see them and interact with them and play with them and talk to them and so on has been really, really awesome and special. So even when he leaves the game, I certainly hope he stays in it and stays close to it.
Vijay, earlier in this interview, you mentioned your interviews with Roger Federer, and you've obviously spent a lot of time with him. But if I could press you to perhaps recount one personal anecdote which is going to always stay in your mind and define Roger Federer for you 20 years from now?
Well, obviously, I spent a lot of time with Federer. We have both been Rolex ambassadors for a long time. We did a lot of interviews together, obviously, for television. Always enjoyed it, talking to wherever I did. Post Wimbledon, needless to say, after his matches, and specifically some wonderful pieces for television I did with him in Dubai. But perhaps the one thing that truly stands out is meeting him for the first time. When I met him for the first time, it was in Shanghai. He was getting ready to play the Shanghai Masters. I was there covering it for television. I was coming down the lift, and there was a lady in the lift with me, and we started talking a bit. And as we were getting off, she introduced herself, and she said, "I followed your career over the years and always admired you," and so on, which is very kind of her. We came out into the lobby, and he said, "I'd like you to meet my son." And she then introduced me to Roger. It was great to meet him. He was obviously in the World Finals. And she said to him, "Roger, you know Vijay," and we chatted a little bit. And she said to him, I always admired him for the way he behaved on the tennis court, and I hope you would do the same." And I thought that was a very special moment coming from his mom. And he said, "Oh, absolutely. I followed his career." So it was really a very important moment as far as I was concerned, meeting someone I knew. Not only had made the finals there, but I knew at that moment in time that he was going to be great and going to be a genius. But I just didn't know that he was going to get this good. So we always look back at players and we say there are good players like all of us were, and then there are great champions like we've seen who are better than us. And then on the odd occasion, there are geniuses. And certainly that's the category he fits in.
Yes, a genius, a magician, you could call him whatever. You could just keep on adding adjectives. But Vijay, we are here to celebrate Roger Federer's career, but I would be doing grave injustice to a true champion of Indian sport as well, Indian tennis as well. Naresh Kumar passed away a couple of days ago, and since we had you, I was wondering if you could pay a small tribute to the grand old man of Indian tennis.
Well, it always comes back to first memories of someone like that. Obviously, so much senior to me and so much of a great champion that he was during the time of the 50s and 60s when he and Krish played great doubles together, and a stalwart of Indian tennis, no question about it. And Krish always talked so highly about him over the years when I played for Krish when he was captain of the Davis Cup team. So, but my earliest memory of Naresh was going to his house when I was 13, 14 years old on my way to Guwahati for a coaching camp. And we were young, hardly any money or good food to eat at the time as we were going through Calcutta, and going to their home. And Sunita and Naresh playing the perfect host. They were wonderful to young players who were coming up at the time. And we got on from that moment on to be very good friends. We continued to meet at Wimbledon constantly during the years of my career of playing. He wrote a fantastic story about my match against Borg, called it my match against Borg that year in '79, the best match of the tournament of the fortnight. So he was always there encouraging youngsters to come along and take over from what they were doing. And all of them left a pathway for us, and Krish and Naresh and Prem and Jay, and all of them that came before us. And we had to beat them to be able to get to be the best in India, and so on and so forth. So the memories of Naresh has always been very, very positive. And more than anything else, he was real. He walked the courts in India like Krish did, like a colossus. And we have really very, very fond memories of seeing Naresh and Sunita at their home on a regular basis in Kolkata.
Yes, to use a reference from the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, he was the Bhishma Pitama of Indian tennis. On that note, thank you so much, Vijay, for your time, for that tribute. And congratulations to you once again for getting top flight tennis back to Chennai.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diggy. It's a wonderful event. It's going on perfectly, thankfully, to the Tamil Nadu government that has been remarkable in supporting sport in Chennai. We are excited about it. The quarterfinal day for us, and hopefully it all ends up very well, and even more great championship tennis comes to India.